Good afternoon. You'll have to excuse me because probably throughout this I will be sipping on what I have here, which is not just a mug but rather a bucket of tea. And as you can probably tell, I'm somewhat dehydrated. I've just been to the pool. Anyway, I'll get straight on with it. When I say autonomous vehicle, you probably think of a drone, or you think of a bomb robot. You think of the sort of stuff you might see in the Terminator, something going around doing its own thing specifically, but how often do you envision that underwater? Well, that's precisely what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about UUVs. So UUV stands for Unmanned Underwater Vehicle. Sort of, in most instances, they're unmanned submarines of sorts. There are multiple types of UUVs. So if you look at their sort of historical use, they were first sort of developed in the 1950s. Obviously, as with pretty much any single bit of technology that's ever been developed, its military use was foreseen and desired and somewhat designed for or planned for. But largely, they were used for deep water or underwater image capture, so it can go to far greater depths than humans can, or could at the time with the systems they had. And sort of in general maritime dealings, it was for sea exploration, for maintenance at depth. And so you might see these, if you're really to classify UUVs, you see two types really. One, which is what we're going to talk about today, which it's pretty much just a submarine, but far smaller, or just a submarine but unmanned, or you get something which is designed to be utility-based, so it might have arms which it can sort of use stuff with, tools, welding tools, that sort of thing. But in a military context, generally they are shaped more like just a small submarine, or at least in an offensive context. So what we're talking about specifically today are the more submarine design UUVs, that being sort of offensive and defensive UUVs, not necessarily designed for what one might call seabed warfare, which is where you basically set up cables, you set up infrastructure, you set up transport lines underwater maybe, pipelines, tunnels, whatever it may be. But these UUVs aren't necessarily designed to set up infrastructure. They are designed for offensive capability, and of course we'll have to talk about utility UUVs at some point because they are really quite fascinating. But today we are going to just talk about, I guess you'd say, military offensive UUVs, or tactical UUVs, as it were, as opposed to for strategic infrastructure use. Apologies for slurping. So, as I've said, these things tend to be fairly small. They're like a small submarine. So if you think of a UUV, an unmanned underwater vehicle, as an unmanned submarine of sorts, it's in a similar sense that a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, it's sort of like an unmanned plane, or a similar sense, or an unmanned aircraft. But anyway, they tend to be smaller than their human-operated counterparts because that gives them sort of higher stealth, which is a positive thing, and generally because they don't involve humans, it means humans don't have to move around in them. In the case of submarines, they can be far smaller because they don't have anything living in them. And so for these medium-sized UUVs, which we're going to look at today, they do, apologies for slurping, they do tend to be really rather small because they don't have to carry, so far, any sort of large munitions, as you might see if you look at apologies, that's a helicopter. If you look at the UK's Trafalgar class, they have to be fairly large. They have to carry Trident missiles, which are in themselves fairly large. But when you have these smaller UUVs, which are not submarines, they don't have to have people or missiles necessarily. So that can change stuff quite a lot. If we're looking at where you picture this environment, I mean, this is probably your first, or at least it's been one of my first conceptions of an unmanned system underwater. What you're probably thinking of is this diver robot, if you will, which is what I sort of thought of. You've got this sort of yellow bubble of a submarine going through with its grappler hands, trying to find treasure or something in a coral reef with beautiful fish and flora and fauna everywhere around, if one can call fish fauna. For military use and actually non-reef observation use, UUVs operate in a far more challenging environment. And that is actually largely why their development hasn't been at the total forefront, or at least perhaps they're not as developed as UAVs are. Because in this challenging environment, they are going to extreme depths, intense water pressure, near if not total darkness, indiscernible and faint noises. They're in the pitch black alone, which, beyond being mildly terrifying, I'm sure, if you're the UUV itself, makes it incredibly difficult to operate in. Because it means that the normal sensors one uses are far more difficult to use. And if one is going to look at UUVs as a means by which to extend the range, or at least the depth capability of a naval force, of a fighting force, then they've got to be able to go lower than submarines, meaning they're going to have even less light than submarine sensors, meaning they're going to have even more advanced sensors than the best submarines on the planet. So really, they are a difficult concept to get right. And that's why they haven't been so much developed, or at least their programs haven't been developed so much for a while. So in regard to early UUVs, in a military context, it was, I believe, Russia or the Soviet Union at the time, during the 1980s, that began developing these deep-sea diving UUVs. For the purposes of sort of ISR, and began sort of foreseeing ISR being intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and began sort of foreseeing that you can put a warhead on this thing and it can act as sort of not only a super precision torpedo, but something that can collect information and data as well, which is incredibly useful. And you can have superior guidance systems because, inherently it is designed to be perhaps more maneuverable than something like a surface torpedo. So, the Soviets in the 1980s developed the SAUV UUV, which it's near identical to the sort of UUV you'd see today, medium-sized, and effectively just designed to go out on its own and go, deep in order to conduct ISR. But the main thing that really pushed this program forward and actually sort of began a little bit of competition between them and the US and the UK and France was in 1987 for their SAUV Salve 2. They added solar panels, which made the time frame for any mission longer. It made just general lifespan longer, because it meant that you didn't have to sort of change it when it got all infested with battery acid and that sort of thing, because these things would be run ragged. And so with a more efficient power source, it could travel more distance, but I'd say more importantly, modifications could be added to make it more efficient in the mission itself. So if you don't have to have so much room for batteries and you can use solar power, solar panels that are built in, then you can add a larger payload or GPS and just generally improve capability. So, from this sort of time, the 1980s, UUVs have been in development in a military context. And generally, so far at least, they haven't so much been for, I guess, destruction of vessels. They've been more for destruction of sea mines, because obviously there are no people in it. It can take greater risks and it can surveil a larger area in a shorter amount of time more efficiently, because it's unmanned. So, it can provide this function of ISR as well, which is also what it's been used for. But that, of course, does require it to actually either use its sonar, which effectively that's just sort of increasing the bounds of the fog of war being the line at which you can see where the enemy is. But sort of more than that, if it wants to observe surface fleets or gain information on surface fleets, actual actionable information from a camera or something, it's got to come to the surface and probably compromise itself. And given that these are meant to be less sort of larger investments than stuff like torpedoes, generally they're not used for that purpose, or haven't been so far, because the range hasn't been as good as one might expect. Because they are expensive pieces of kit with very good technology in them that, if acquired, could be sort of compromising to one's own fighting force. They generally don't tend to surface and do that sort of thing, or just blow themselves up and act as sort of smart torpedoes, as it were. So, as these unmanned systems have become more potent, they have been able to deep dive and engage in, as I've said, seabed warfare, where you sort of place infrastructure on the bottom of the sea. And I'm not sure, I think seabed warfare would be far more interesting if it was just a load of an army of genetically augmented super crabs or something going at it with grenade launchers. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. While seabed warfare isn't necessarily as exciting as the clashing of crabs, if you get these utility UUVs designed to place seabed sort of infrastructure and conduct seabed warfare or electronic warfare, the UUVs that are used in an offensive or attacking or defensive or ISR capability are really able to enhance that, because it gives them longer, it shows them the true time frame, it allows them to see beyond the fog of war, and allows them to actually envision where or how much time they have before they're intercepted, before their position is found. So these sort of utility, and I really have no idea what to call them, I'm just going to continue calling them, what should I call them? Munitions or offensive UAVs. Offensive UAVs and utility UAVs can work in unison, and that's what we're seeing as more autonomous systems come into play and you have higher connectivity, which was particularly difficult at high depths and in darkness and at high pressure. That's now becoming a more realistic goal. So I think that's rather good, and that's what we're beginning to see a bit more of. Anyway, I think that the idea of the UUV isn't something that's often appreciated as much as the UAV in a military context. It has massive military applicability, and I think governments and firms and films actually are beginning to recognize this. So, let me introduce you to what is probably your first vision of this offensive military UUV, Riptide. So, Riptide is a series by BAE Systems, it really is constantly improving, changing, evolving in a way. But the specifications for the purpose of this video, or at least the capabilities for the purposes of this video, are for BAE Systems UUV-12. So, for UUV-12, there are lots of variations. It's configurable. So there are three micro variations, I think, so that's effectively a smaller version, harder to trace, and I think they can coordinate with each other, and sort of a man-portable version. So you have different models as need suit. So there are inherently different models, but beyond the different models in themselves and the UUVs that came before this, what we see is the ability to specialize, to configure UUV-12. So one can have versions or configure it in a manner that floods the payload bay, which, might be something desirable, which has a dry payload bay, custom UUVs with specialized sonar, 900 Hz sonar, specialized sonar units, ACOMs, miniaturized units. But generally, just at least for this one, I'm going to talk about the standard model. And I call it the standard model, but there really is nothing standard about it. Riptide is not only agile and, configured really effectively, as we've talked about being important in other videos, this ability to adapt, to configure, and be versatile, but be specialized for the mission objective. This effective specialization is absolutely essential. And I think BAE's been really good with this. BAE has been clear on Riptide. It's not just a sort of dinky little submarine. It is for the modern warfighter. They describe it as being able to use, I think the phrase is power-hungry payloads, which I quite like that idea. Anyway, the payloads can certainly be really substantial. It can use acoustics to greater effect. It has friend and foe identification capability, missile autonomy, great navigation, electronic warfare capabilities, radio wave collection and detection. The list really does go on. It's got a lot of capability, and it can operate in the most challenging environments. So as stated, a lot of UUVs, but especially Riptide, it's not just a torpedo, despite its small size. It has key systems features like its, aforementioned versatility, configurability, meaning it's ready for different mission types and it can act and react in adaptive, specialized manner through, for example, the major use of acoustic technology. Also, Riptide is a vehicle with high endurance, which is something, as we've said, that's important. So as with the Salve 2, the extension of, power, or at least operational time before battery runs out, is a very positive thing. So not only does it, ensure low detectability, because it's in the pitch black and stuff, and it's rather small in comparison to something like a submarine, but it uses low noise propulsion systems and runs on alkaline batteries, which give it about a day and a half of operational time, which, in comparison to some other models that are similar, or at least predecessors, they only had operational times of about 2 hours, which was thought to be enough to carry out operations, but the longer the time, the better, I say. And I think that's really the point, that this thing is constantly improving and changing and can be configured, and those configurations are not set, like Type 31. They are still also evolving. For all of this information, though, BAE does not give regular updates, as it were. This is from what we last heard, so even from this information, which is, I believe, 2020, 2021, or roughly around that time, I guess, most of the stuff I've looked at, it will be updated from there. It currently, as you're watching this, is improved from what I'm telling you. So these are just its basic capabilities. In regard to sort of just general efficiency, it has massively improved electronic efficiency to prior UUV models, which is, I think, an incredibly positive thing. And this allows it to have excellent sensors, which, as we've said, in the pitch black alone. In low light environments, it's really rather industry-leading, these sensors, and obviously essential if you're wanting to ensure operational capability at the bottom of the ocean. And particularly if they have a day and a half of operational capability, this really allows them some time to maneuver, to be as strategic as possible in order to have the most tactical advantage. And as I've also said, the advance in specialised versions allow continued innovative freedom for BAE, and that's, I think, a very positive thing because they've taken it in a good direction so far. So, Riptide is adept at military purposes, as we've sort of ascertained, but it's also pretty adept for civilian use, so commercially. And I think that's fairly good, and the sort of use commercially will be quite important potentially, because the ISR value of this isn't just valuable in a military sense, so the technology can be implemented beyond that, and that also increases BAE's civilian profits, which I think, again, perhaps not positive or negative, but good to branch out into the market. And just to sort of... Actually, no, I'll talk about this first. In regard to launch capability. So, Riptide is, I think, pretty special in comparison to some other stuff. So, in regard to UAVs, you ship them out, you have to fuel them up, you have to do a million checks on them, you've got to do a lot of stuff before they are operational. Perhaps not with the upcoming, Concept 1 and Concept 2, we don't know, but the technology we have at the moment for Riptide, all it requires is for you to pick a configuration, or just pick the standard unit, get it on a plane, or don't get it on a plane, walk it to wherever it needs to be, and chuck it in the water. That's it. I'm not saying a 3-year-old could launch it, but a 3-year-old could launch it, and I think that's a very positive thing. It has very, very quick operational capability, and that is another very positive thing. So the question is, where can Riptide sort of be launched from in a military sense? So in development, they've tested it releasing from apertures, which is what might hold a missile or a torpedo in the olden days. It's effectively that, and it just goes like that and releases it into the water. But it's also been chucked off of ribs, thrown off paddle boats even. It really is that ready. And I would potentially speculate what I think might happen is there's a chance they could be dropped as torpedoes are, considering that in anti-submarine warfare, in mine countermeasure warfare, which is what we know UUVs have been used for, largely in the past, I'd speculate that they could be dropped from helicopters from the aperture on the side, which would give them a lot more operational versatility, higher range, and generally, you can put them in an area of water quicker that's higher risk. They can gather far more intelligence and have far higher ISR value in that manner. And, that's in the special interest of having to use battery life. And for battery life, I think we will see some development. And how they can be launched, we will also see some development in that. But currently, it seems they have infinite possibilities for launch. So we'll see how and if they are actually implemented for launch. But for UUVs in general, what's being worked on at the moment mainly is increasing electronic capability, which, Riptide already has incredible electronic capability. It's incredibly electronically efficient, very good communication. It's very well wired, industry-leading sensors, that sort of thing. But this also means higher maneuverability. So I would venture that for UUVs, they are a massively underappreciated concept. That a UUV might even have more use than a UAV. A UUV can potentially destroy a billion-pound ship rather than a multi-million-pound tank or a multi-million-pound building. Who knows? But potentially they do have higher value, particularly considering that naval warfare, there's not too much employed in this regard for actually properly offensive capabilities. So we'll see what happens. But I think if this can be sort of made maximally efficient, particularly warhead capability, it could be incredibly useful. And if you make a slightly larger variant that can launch torpedoes, that's incredibly useful as well, because these unmanned vehicles can get closer than helicopters can. That would be the new meta idea, as useful as the Wildcat and the Merlin have been, and we see that in the oncoming frigates. If you're using something like Riptide, or a larger variant, a far larger variant, you can carry and launch the same number of torpedoes at a longer range and in a more precarious scenario, in a more precarious stance. So I think that would be incredibly useful. But we'll see. I think they're probably more useful than UAVs or UGVs in regard to pure sort of monetary trade-off, but I think I've probably rambled on for long enough. So that's the end.